What if I told you that at the heart of the glittering Victorian era, there existed a caste of women who were ghosts in their own homes? They wore silk but ate leftovers. They were more educated than their masters but had no voice, and their lives resembled walking on thin ice over an abyss of poverty. They were not maids who washed floors, but they were not part of the family they served either, remaining in a strange and painful social isolation. They were called impoverished ladies, and for many of them, this profession was the only way to avoid starvation while maintaining the appearance of decency. Society demanded impeccable morals and profound knowledge from them, but paid them with cold contempt and humiliating loneliness in attic rooms. Watch the video to the end to find out how one mistake could turn a respected mentor into an outcast for whom all the doors of London were closed. What if I told you that the most terrible loneliness befell these women not in an empty room, but in the midst of a noisy family dinner? Imagine a large, richly decorated dining room where an aristocratic family gathers around a long table to discuss the latest news, balls, and politics. The governess sat there too, but she was surrounded by an invisible glass wall that separated her from lively human interaction. She was not allowed to initiate conversation. She could not laugh at the guests' jokes unless addressed directly, and even her choice of food was limited. She was physically present in the space, but socially absent, fulfilling the role of a living piece of furniture that had to be useful but invisible. This created tremendous psychological pressure when a woman lived surrounded by people for years, but was not allowed to experience simple human emotions or friendly conversation. Her status as a lady was her curse because it did not allow her to go down to the kitchen and socialize with the servants, where a simpler and livelier atmosphere prevailed. The maids and cooks saw her as a competitor who turned up her nose, even though she earned little more than they did, and often played petty tricks on her. On the other hand, her employers saw her as an employee who was paid money, and any display of familiarity on her part was considered a gross violation of the chain of command. She hung in a vacuum between floors, too noble for the kitchen, but too poor for the living room. Every evening, she had to play her role perfectly, hiding her fatigue, irritation, or melancholy behind a mask of polite obedience. This situation was exacerbated by the fact that the governess was often the same age as the lady of the house or her older daughters, but was deprived of their privileges. She saw beautiful dresses that she could never afford, heard about trips she would never be taken on, and watched romances that were forbidden to her. The daily contemplation of someone else's celebration of life, to which you have no connection, slowly ate away at your soul and gave rise to a deep inner bitterness. She had to teach other people's daughters how to shine in society, knowing that she herself would forever remain in the shadow of these young debutantes. It was a sophisticated torture of hope and proximity to luxury that remained unattainable, even though it was within arm's reach. The governess's clothing was also a strict marker of her intermediate position, distinguished by its emphasized modesty and lack of fashionable details. She was not allowed to wear bright colors, expensive jewelry, or dresses with deep necklines, so as not to overshadow the mistress of the house or attract unnecessary attention from male guests. Usually these were dresses in gray, brown, or dark blue tones, made of practical and durable wool, which served for years. Even if she still had silk dresses from her previous, happier life, wearing them was considered bad form and a challenge to public order. Her appearance had to convey humility, professionalism, and a complete rejection of feminine coquetry. The psychological strain of constant self-control often led to nervous breakdowns, which at the time were attributed to female weakness or hysteria. The inability to express themselves, complain, or simply be themselves turned these women into withdrawn, dry, and prim creatures, as they were often portrayed in literature. But this dryness was only a protective shell under which lay a living, suffering soul, thirsting for warmth and understanding. They conducted endless internal monologues, confiding their thoughts only to diaries, which became their only interlocutors. History knows many examples when, after the death of a governess, volumes of notebooks full of pain and despair were found. There was no way out of this social trap except marriage, which was almost impossible for a woman without a dowry. Most men in their circle were looking for brides with money, and men from lower classes were not suitable for them in terms of status and upbringing. A governess was doomed to watch time slip away, her chances for personal happiness melting away with each year spent in someone else's home. She turned into an old maid before everyone's eyes, becoming an object of pity or ridicule. And the older she got, the thinner the invisible line separating her from complete poverty became. Social isolation was reinforced by the architecture of Victorian mansions, where specific areas were set aside for the governess. Her room was often located on the top floor, next to the nursery or servants' quarters, but was furnished slightly better to emphasize her special status. However, she was not allowed to move freely through the formal halls without being summoned or having a reason to do so. She was a prisoner of certain corridors and rooms, and her every step was controlled by unspoken rules. Even the air she breathed seemed to belong not to her, but to her employers. This feeling was especially acute on holidays, when the house was filled with guests, music, and laughter. The governess could watch the ball from the upper landing or through a half-open door, remaining an invisible spectator of someone else's happiness. At such moments, the contrast between her noble origins and her current servile position was particularly painful. She might be sent a glass of wine or a plate of cookies as a handout, but she was not invited to join the dancers. It was a reminder that she was merely a function, a mechanism for teaching, not a living person. Despite all the humiliation, many governesses maintained an impeccable sense of dignity, which was their only protection. They kept their backs straight, spoke in refined English, and demonstrated encyclopedic knowledge, forcing those around them to respect them, at least outwardly. This inner armor helped them survive, but it also made them even more lonely and inaccessible for simple communication. Pride was their last bastion, which they defended with desperate tenacity, not allowing anyone to see their tears. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about living in such a golden cage in full view of everyone? Could you withstand such moral pressure? Write about it in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about the hidden tragedies of the past. Are you ready to learn the truth about how ladies fell into this trap? Most governesses were not born into poverty. They were the daughters of gentlemen, officers, priests, or successful merchants. They spent their childhoods in cozy living rooms, taking lessons in music, drawing, and French, and were prepared for the role of mistresses of their own estates. None of them imagined that one day these skills would become not a leisure activity, but the only way to earn a living. Fate often struck suddenly. The death of a father, a bad investment, the bankruptcy of the family bank, or a brother's card debts. In Victorian society, the financial collapse of the head of the family meant instant social death for all his household members. Yesterday's friends stopped sending invitations, creditors seized property, and the family home was auctioned off to pay debts. Physical labor, working in a factory or a shop, was unthinkable, as it would mean the final loss of lady status and a transition to a lower class. Becoming a seamstress or dressmaker meant living in slums and ruining one's eyesight for pennies, which was also considered a fall to the very bottom. The only profession that allowed her to retain at least some semblance of belonging to her class was teaching in private homes. This was a compromise that society was willing to accept, allowing a ruined lady to sell her knowledge without losing the right to call herself a lady. This transition was traumatic and abrupt. From a beloved daughter and enviable bride, a girl turned into a hired worker. She had to leave her hometown so that none of her acquaintances would see her humiliation and look for a place in the house of strangers. She packed her modest belongings, said goodbye to her dreams of balls and receptions, and boarded a stagecoach that took her into the unknown. It was like voluntary exile, like going to a convent, only without the spiritual comfort and support of sisters. The labor market for governesses was oversaturated as the economic crises of the era ruined thousands of middle-class families. A single advertisement in the Times could attract hundreds of applicants willing to work for a pittance. Competition was fierce, and employers could afford to be extremely picky, demanding knowledge of several languages, music, and painting for pennies. Girls had to agree to any conditions just to have a roof over their heads and a table. A governess's salary was often laughable, barely exceeding the earnings of a good cook or housekeeper. From this money, she had to pay for her own clothes, laundry, trips to visit her family, and, most importantly, save for her old age. Many of them sent most of their earnings to their impoverished mothers or younger sisters, denying themselves everything. It was a life of constant economizing, where every coin spent caused feelings of guilt and fear for the future. Psychologically, the most difficult thing was realizing that you were serving a class of people to which you yourself had belonged just yesterday. Often, governesses were girls from old but impoverished families who were hired by wealthy nouveau riche who had made their fortunes in trade or industry. She had to teach good manners to the daughters of shopkeepers who looked down on her, having only money but no education. This created tension mixed with class pride and financial dependence. The status of a fallen angel of the economy haunted the governess everywhere, reminding her of what she had lost. In the eyes of society, her poverty was a kind of moral flaw, a punishment for the sins of her fathers or her family's inability to manage money. People sympathized with her, but it was a sympathy tinged with superiority that hurt more than outright contempt. She was a living reminder of how fragile prosperity was, and for that, too, she could not be forgiven. For many girls, this path began with the illusion that it was temporary, that they would soon save up money or meet someone. But reality quickly shattered these hopes, dragging them into a routine of endless lessons and lonely evenings. The temporary situation stretched into decades, turning into a life sentence, and each new day began with the thought that their past life was irretrievably lost. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of romance in that era? In the next chapter, we'll talk about why love was the most dangerous trap of all for a governess. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as a plot for women's novels, because reality was far more terrifying than fiction. In literature, we often encounter a plot where a poor teacher falls in love with a governess, or even a rich master loses his head over her, as in Jane Eyre. In reality, however, a young single woman in a stranger's house was not the heroine, but easy prey for the male inhabitants of the nation. She lived under the same roof as men, but had no protection from her family or brothers who could defend her honor. The sons of the owners, returning from universities or regiments, often saw the governess as a convenient object of entertainment. She was a lady, which meant she was pleasant to talk to. She was pure and well-mannered, but at the same time she was dependent and defenseless. Flirting with the governess was a kind of sport, a dangerous game that carried no risk for the man except a mild reprimand from his parents. For the girl, however, any hint of scandal meant instant dismissal without references and the end of her career. If a governess succumbed to courtship, sincerely believing in the feelings of a young gentleman, the ending was always tragic. Pregnancy outside of marriage for a woman of her circle was tantamount to social death and a direct path to prostitution. Upon learning of the relationship, the employers would immediately show her the door, accusing her of corrupting their son and trying to marry him. No one listened to her excuses because a gentleman's word always carried more weight than that of a hired worker. Even if the girl was steadfast and rejected the claims, she still ended up losing. The rejected suitor could spread dirty rumors about her out of revenge or complain to his mother about her immodest behavior. The lady of the house, who was always on guard for the morality and interests of the family, preferred to dismiss the problematic governess rather than investigate the true causes of the conflict. Beauty and youth were not a gift for a governess, but a dangerous burden that had to be carefully hidden. Fathers of families also often showed an unhealthy interest in educated and modest girls living in homes. This created an unbearable atmosphere where the governess was afraid to be left alone with the master of the house. She had to be constantly on guard, avoiding counters and locked the bedroom door. The constant fear of harassment turned life into a wealthy home threaten or break. There was no third option in a world where feelings were the privilege of the rich. Like if you were moved by the fate of these women, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Guess how long it took to create the perfect conditions for domestic humiliation? A governess's living conditions were a clear reflection of her status. Not quite a servant, but not quite a person either. Most often, she was housed on the top floor, in the so-called classroom or in a tiny bedroom next to the nursery. These rooms were freezing in winter, as saving coal in homes, even those of wealthy people, was the norm, especially for staff quarters. Drafts from the windows, poor heating, and dampness became her constant companions, leading to chronic illnesses and early rheumatism. The furniture in her room usually consisted of old things that were no longer suitable for the formal rooms, but were too good for the servants. A hard bed, a worn-out armchair, a simple wash basin, and a table for checking notebooks. That was her whole world. There was no comfort here, no cute little things that create a homey atmosphere. It was a government-owned space, a temporary shelter that could never become a real refuge. The governess's meals were a separate source of humiliation, often hidden under the guise of etiquette. If there were no guests in the house, she could dine with the family, but she was often served the most modest portions. If a dinner party was held, her portion was brought to her room on a tray. By the time the food reached the upper floor, it was already cold and the tea was lukewarm and tasteless. Her day began before dawn, long before the lady of the house woke up, and ended late at night. She had no set working hours. She was on duty as long as the children were awake. Even after the children had gone to bed, she had to mend their clothes, prepare lessons for the next day, or carry out small tasks for the lady of the house. The concept of personal time was absent from her contract as such. The lack of normal lighting in her room was also a problem, as candles were expensive and were issued by the housekeeper on account. Governesses had to ruin their eyesight by checking notebooks or doing needlework in the dim light of a candle stub. As a result, many of them began to go blind by the age of 40. Glasses were considered a sign of old age and could be a reason for refusal to hire. Hygiene was also difficult. Servants were reluctant to carry hot water, considering it extra work. Taking a bath was an event that required arrangements and often humiliating requests. A governess had to look neat and clean, but the conditions for maintaining this cleanliness were Spartan. She had to wash herself with ice-cold water from a jug, shivering from the cold in an unheated bedroom. The soundproofing in such rooms was poor, and the governess heard everything that was happening in the house while remaining invisible. The crying of children, the swearing of servants, the noise of parties downstairs. All this invaded her space, giving her no peace. She lived at the center of someone else's life, without having a life of her own. On Sundays, her only day off, she was expected to attend church with the family. Even prayer was part of her duties, a demonstration of piety and proper child-rearing. She sat on a hard bench behind her employers and prayed for a miracle that never happened. Letters from home were her only ray of light, but even receiving them depended on the butler's mercy. Mail came to a general address, and the mistress could examine the envelopes addressed to the governess with curiosity or suspicion. Personal correspondence was not secret, and this deprived the girl of her last sense of privacy. Her room was not a fortress, but a solitary confinement cell with a view of the garden, which she was only allowed to enter with the children. And what do you think was the most difficult thing about teaching subjects that she herself barely knew? In the next chapter, you will find out what the children were actually taught. The governess's task was not to give the girls a fundamental education, but to make them pleasant for society. A deep knowledge of mathematics, natural sciences, or philosophy was considered not only unnecessary, but also harmful for a woman. Therefore, the curriculum consisted of a set of superficial skills called accomplishments. It was the art of appearing educated without actually being so. The governess taught her pupils to play the piano, sing, paint with watercolors, and embroider. These were the skills necessary to entertain guests in the living room and attract a potential suitor. If a girl sang out of tune or drew poorly, the teacher was always to blame. She was asked to do the impossible, to instill talent where it did not exist naturally. Foreign languages, especially French, were a mandatory part of the curriculum for any self-respecting lady. A governess had to speak with a Parisian accent, even if she had never traveled beyond her own county. She had to study grammar at night so as not to embarrass herself in front of her students in the morning. Lessons were based on boring, moralizing books that were intended to shape character rather than intellect. History and geography were taught as a set of dates and names that had to be memorized. No analysis, no discussion, just mechanical memorization of facts. The governess was a living encyclopedia, obliged to provide information on demand. If she did not know something, it was perceived as a sign of her incompetence and poor background. Particular attention was paid to manners and posture, how to enter a room, how to hold a cup of tea, how to curtsy. The governess drilled the girls for hours using special boards for their backs and books on their heads. She was a sculptor who molded lively, restless children into perfect porcelain dolls. This required angelic patience and strict discipline. At the same time, the governess had no real leverage over the disobedient children. She had no right to punish them physically. That was the privilege of the parents. If the children were rude to her, refused to study, or teased her, she could only complain to their mother, which often backfired on her. "You don't know how to approach children," was the standard response from the mistress of the house. The children often sensed the governess's precarious position and took advantage of it, making her life hell. They would put frogs in her bed, ruin her belongings, or tell their parents tall tales. The governess had to endure all this with Christian humility without losing her composure. In addition to teaching, she was often given the duties of a nanny, to monitor the children's hygiene, clothing, and behavior at the table. She was with them constantly, responsible for their safety and health. If a child fell and broke their knee, it was the governess's fault for not watching her charge closely enough. The paradox was that the governess had to be smarter than the parents in order to teach their children, but at the same time she had to skillfully hide her intelligence so as not to hurt the self-esteem of her employers. She walked a tightrope, balancing between competence and obedience. It was a job that required encyclopedic knowledge, pedagogical talent, and the diplomatic skills of an ambassador, and all this for a salary that was barely enough to buy new gloves. What if I told you that every day of a governess's life was filled with an icy fear of the future? In Victorian England, there was no labor code, no unions, and no social protection for such workers. A governess could be dismissed at any moment at the whim of her mistress, for a cheeky look, for an old-fashioned dress, or simply because the children had grown up. And the worst thing about being fired was not the loss of income, but the loss of a reference. A written recommendation from a previous employer was the only passport to the professional world. Without this piece of paper signed by a lady confirming her morality and skills, a governess could not find employment in a respectable household. The threat of leaving without a reference was the most powerful tool of blackmail in the hands of employers. It meant an instant fall to the bottom of society, a wolf ticket that closed all doors. A woman who found herself on the street without references or money fell into a terrible vortex of poverty. First, she sold her modest jewelry and clothes, moving to increasingly cheaper rooms. Then, when her savings ran out, she was faced with a choice: a workhouse or the street. For a lady raised with strict moral principles, both options were worse than death. The workhouse was a place of horror, a prison for the poor, where people were forced to perform hard labor for a bowl of thin soup. To end up there meant to completely lose one's human dignity and status. Many former governesses preferred to starve to death in a cold attic than suffer the humiliation of the workhouse. Pride prevented them from begging or turning to charitable night shelters. The fear of falling, engaging in prostitution, was a haunting nightmare for society, and governesses were at risk. Stories of noble maidens forced to sell their bodies for a piece of bread stirred the imagination and frightened people to the point of trembling. The reality was that without the protection of family and money, a single woman in London was completely powerless. Illness was another harbinger of disaster. If a governess fell seriously ill, she was not treated but simply dismissed for fear of contagion or unnecessary trouble. To find oneself sick, without money or a roof over one's head, was the fate that everyone feared. Tuberculosis, the scourge of the time, decimated their ranks at an alarming rate due to poor living conditions. Competition from younger and more educated girls grew every year. After 30, it became increasingly difficult to find a good position, and after 40, it was almost impossible. A governess understood that her marketability was fading and that she would not be able to save enough for her old age. She became a mouth to feed, spent material. This constant stress and uncertainty about the future led to deep depression and even suicide. The newspapers of the time were full of reports about women found in the Thames or who had poisoned themselves with laudanum. It was a quiet, desperate protest against the system that had crushed them. Society was aware of the problem, but preferred to turn a blind eye. It was more convenient to believe that if a lady had fallen to the bottom, it was her own fault or a moral failing. The victim was blamed for her misfortunes, justifying society's own indifference. Were there any attempts to help these unfortunate women? In the next chapter, we will talk about charity, which was a drop in the ocean of need. In the mid-19th century, the problem of destitute governesses became so obvious that it was impossible to ignore. In 1841, the Charitable Society for Governesses was founded. This was an attempt by society to assuage its guilt towards women whom it had denied any rights. The organization set itself ambitious goals to provide temporary accommodation, to set up a savings bank, and to pay small pensions to the elderly. However, the society's resources were negligible compared to the scale of the disaster. The queue for a tiny pension, only $15.20 per year, was huge, and women had to wait years for it. Often, help came too late, when the former teacher was already dying of exhaustion or illness. The waiting lists were published in newspapers, which was a public acknowledgement of their plight. The society also opened a shelter for elderly governesses, but there were catastrophically few places available. To get in, you had to go through a humiliating screening process, prove your poverty, impeccable reputation, and membership in the Anglican Church. Women had to gather votes and support from influential patrons, as if they were participating in a political election for the right to die in warmth. The irony was that the charity work was done by the same ladies who hired governesses and paid them pennies. By organizing charity bazaars and balls for poor teachers, they felt like virtuous Christians. At the same time, the idea of simply raising the salaries of their own governesses rarely occurred to them. It was classic Victorian hypocrisy, helping the abstract poor while exploiting specific individuals. Nevertheless, the society did something really important. It began to raise the issue of professional status. Evening courses and lectures were opened at King's College, where women could improve their qualifications and obtain a certificate. This was the first step in transforming the governess from a poor relative into a professional teacher. The creation of a job registry at the society helped many avoid the clutches of scammers and unscrupulous agencies. Now girls had a safe place where they could look for work without fear of being cheated. This gave them at least some sense of security in the predatory world of hiring. But even with the society's help, old age remained their worst enemy. Lonely old women in worn-out dresses, renting a corner in cold rooms, became a familiar part of the cityscape. They lived out their lives in poverty, preserving the remnants of their former dignity, rereading the books they had once taught to others. For many, emigration was their salvation. Charitable organizations offered to pay for tickets to colonies, Australia, Canada, or New Zealand, where there was a shortage of women and teachers. It was a one-way ticket, a leap into the unknown, but it offered the chance of a new life and perhaps marriage. Those who remained in England and did not receive assistance often ended their days in the common wards of hospitals for the poor. They were buried in mass graves, and the names their fathers had once been proud of disappeared forever. Charity was only a band-aid on a deep social wound. It did not solve the main problem: the lack of women's rights to decent work and independence. The situation of English governesses was exacerbated by the fashion for all things foreign. French and German governesses were considered more prestigious because they could teach children a living language without an accent. In aristocratic homes, the presence of a madam or Fräulein was a sign of high status and good taste. This put additional pressure on local women who had to compete with newcomers. Foreign women were often more educated, as the system of female education on the continent was better developed. They brought with them new methods, music, and literature, which set them apart from the prime English women. However, their position was even more vulnerable. They were strangers not only in the house, but also in the country. Attitudes toward them were ambivalent. On the one hand, there was admiration for their exoticism and charm. On the other, there was suspicion and xenophobia. French women were often considered frivolous and morally unstable, suspected of attempting to seduce their employers. German women were stereotypically perceived as strict and sentimental, but sometimes rude. Foreign governesses often fell victim to religious prejudice. A Catholic woman in a Protestant household was always suspected of trying to convert the children to her faith. She was forbidden to pray openly or keep icons and was forced to attend Anglican services. This spiritual violence was the norm at the time. The loneliness of foreign women was absolute. While an English woman could at least write a letter to her family or go home on vacation, a French or German woman was cut off from her family by the sea and expensive tickets. She did not hear her native language for years, except in lessons, and often forgot her language out of longing. Many of them ended up in England through dubious agencies that promised them the moon, but in reality sent the girls to remote areas or to homes with a questionable reputation. Unfamiliar with the laws and customs, they were easy prey for exploitation. It was impossible to return home without money, and they found themselves hostage to the situation. Conflicts between English and foreign governesses in the same house, if the family was very wealthy, were commonplace. It was a silent war for influence over the children and the favor of the mistress of the house. Intrigues, gossip, and petty sabotage poisoned the atmosphere in the classroom. Nevertheless, it was the influx of foreign women that made English women think about improving their level of education. Competition became the engine of progress, forcing society to rethink educational standards for women. The fates of these immigrant women were even more tragic than those of the locals. They died in a foreign land, and often their names were misspelled on their gravestones, as no one cared about the correct spelling. It was a global market for female labor, ruthless and cynical, where nationality was just another characteristic of the commodity. Surprisingly, the governess's main enemies in the house were often not the owners, but the servants. It would seem that they should have sympathized with each other as hired workers, but the social hierarchy created an insurmountable gap. The servants saw the governess as a class enemy, an impoverished aristocrat who had invaded their territory without knowing the rules of the game. The governess demanded respect and to be addressed as Miss. She was to be served meals and have her room cleaned. For a maid or footman who worked physically from morning to night, it was insulting to serve a woman who did nothing but sit with a book. They considered her work easy and useless, not understanding the emotional strain of the profession. Another source of conflict was money. A governess, receiving a meager salary and spending it on clothes, could not afford to tip the servants as guests did in the house. In the world of servants, not tipping was seen as greed or an insult. This led to petty revenge: cold tea, unpolished shoes, forgotten mail. The governess was also an outsider in the world of servants because she lived by the rules of her employers. She could not gossip with them in the servants' quarters, drink beer, or discuss the masters. Her silence and aloofness were perceived as arrogance and pride. Neither fish nor fowl, they said about her in the kitchen. Often, the governess was forced to act as a spy. The mistress could ask her about the behavior of the servants, and any answer she gave could be interpreted as a denunciation. The servants knew this and feared her, which only intensified their hostility. The atmosphere of mutual distrust poisoned life in the house. Sometimes the opposite situation occurred when an old nanny who had raised the children was jealous of their new young teacher. It was a battle for the love of the pupils, in which all means were acceptable. The nanny could turn the children against the governess, undermining her authority. Sometimes the governess's only ally was the housekeeper, who occupied a high position in the hierarchy of servants. If she managed to establish a good relationship with her, life became bearable. But more often than not, the governess was left alone against a whole clan united by common interests and secrets. This confrontation between the upper and lower floors was exhausting for the nerves. The governess had to fight a war on two fronts, proving her usefulness to the owners and fending off the passive aggression of the servants. Ultimately, she was the most powerless figure in the house, as the servants were protected by their numbers and traditions, while she was alone. Her loneliness was absolute, even among a crowd of people. How did the journey of these women end when they could no longer work? In the next chapter, we will learn about the fate that awaited most of them. Old age for a Victorian governess was not a time of rest, but a time of final collapse. There were no pensions, savings were negligible, and relatives were often already dead or in need themselves. When her eyesight weakened and her strength faded, the woman was faced with the question of physical survival. The lucky few were able to remain in the homes of their grown pupils as companions or lodgers. They helped with the housework, knitted socks for their grandchildren, and lived out their lives in warmth, but without a place of their own. This was considered a lucky break, a rare stroke of good fortune, a reward for decades of devoted service. The majority, however, found themselves cast aside. Newspapers were full of advertisements from elderly ladies willing to work for food and shelter. They agreed to any job, mending laundry, caring for the sick, looking after the house in the absence of the owners. Pride was broken by necessity. The madhouses of that era were filled with former governesses with frightening regularity. Years of emotional suppression, loneliness, and fear led to mental breakdowns. They were found wandering the streets, talking to imaginary students, and locked up in hospitals from which there was no return. The theme of the mad governess became popular in Gothic literature for a reason. It was a reflection of a real social phenomenon. The society that had driven these women mad now turned away from them in horror. Some tried to open their own small schools, but without capital or connections, these ventures often failed. Competition with large boarding schools was lost in advance. These were desperate attempts to maintain independence, doomed to failure. Death often came to them alone, in cheap furnished rooms. Their possessions fit into a single trunk, a few books, old dresses, and a stack of letters. They left no legacy except the knowledge they passed on to other people's children, who may not even have remembered their old teacher. The history of governesses is a history of hidden heroism. They carried culture and knowledge, sacrificing their personal lives and happiness. They were the foundation on which the education of the Victorian elite was built, but they themselves remained buried under that foundation. Their fate became the catalyst for the first feminist movements. It was by looking at the powerlessness of governesses that women began to demand the right to higher education and decent professions. Their suffering did not go unnoticed, becoming fuel for future change. We must remember them not as comical characters in bonnets, but as tragic figures, hostages of an era that knew no mercy for single women. The history of Victorian governesses is a chronicle of quiet, invisible heroism and profound tragedy. They were women who lived in golden cages, seeing luxury but not having the right to touch it. Their lives were an endless lesson in humility, patience, and survival in a world where a single woman without money was nobody. They sacrificed their youth, love, and future to raise a generation that built an empire. But the empire itself forgot their names. What other forgotten female professions of the past would you like to see in our next episodes? Perhaps the history of companions or dressmakers? Suggest your topics in the comments below the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover the dark pages of history with us.